Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my show. Um, Today, I'd like to mark an anniversary. I'd like to be immodest and celebrate this book. Back in 1995, the British Council and Vintage Books published New Writing 4, edited by A.S. Byatt and Alan Hollinghurst. There's a list of contributors on the back, which is a bit of a who's who. It's an amazing list with people like Faye Weldon and who else? Hanif Qureshi, Tibor Fisher, Brian Aldiss, all these amazing people. And in the middle of it, me. It's my first published short story, March 1995. And it led to my first book deal. It led to the same publisher contacting me. And, well, there's a chapter about this in my memoir that I'm writing. My memoir of being a writer and being a writing teacher. So I've read some bits in the last couple of weeks. I thought I'd read you this bit about March 1995 and first being published. Let's see how this goes. It begins on campus in 97, a couple of years into this career. When Mali, who's my new friend on campus, this tall, skinny goth, and various others on campus told me that I'd been very lucky, or that I'd had it so easy getting into print so quickly and so young, it wasn't at all true. As I said before, I'd felt very old at 25, and as if I'd been flogging my guts out to get a book out since I was about 9 years old. I still had letters from very kind editors at Puffin Books who'd read my childish chapters and encouraged me to keep trying. It had all felt like a very uphill struggle, even when I was doing my own MA at Lancaster University and had to convince my group of fellow writers each week that I was allowed to stir together the gritty realism of a council estate upbringing with phantasmagorical moments of magical realism. They were all convinced that I was mixing things that shouldn't go together, and that I was being far too explicit with the sexuality and gender stuff. But I always felt I knew just what I was doing. My publisher, my first publisher, was a very fine one, Chatto and Windus, who handled many of the writers I loved. They also published the anthology that my first short story appeared in, Plucked Out of the Pile by Harriet Bouquet in 1994, just when I was starting, for the first time, to doubt myself and run out of steam. Just the acceptance of a story was enough to get me through the next year, teaching hourly classes and working on my critical PhD, on queerness and magical realism, of course. And then, in the spring of 1995, my story was published and I went to London like Dick Whittington to be at the launch party in a bookshop on Charing Cross Road. I felt like I was suddenly in literature. Literature was happening all around me. I went with my agent, who had taken me on after the sale of my story. She was a cigarello-smoking lesbian who had a slightly dazed look and seemed to have wandered in from a different era. Like many people I met in publishing during those first months of entering that world, I almost felt like she was cosplaying her role. I saw young editors in tweed suits and old-fashioned glasses, publicists in pearls and silk scarves. It was almost as if, milling about in these bookshops with glasses of wine and murmuring together, they were dressing up as the old fogies they imagined they needed to become. It was all a case of trying to look the part, in case there was some kind of surprise inspection. It took me time to realise that their incredible naffness, drawling complacency, and giggling entitlement was down to the fact that people in this world of publishing were all incredibly posh. Posher than anyone I'd ever met in my whole life. There were more posh people per square yard at that first book launch party I went to at Books Etc. than almost anywhere in the world, and that was why they were so dressed up, rather fustily and archaically. They all really did belong to another era. I was welcomed nicely enough, shuffling shyly at the edges. The first person I met was a science fiction author in his 60s who was a kind of legend in my eyes. I hardly believed he even really existed as a person. He was 7 feet tall and demonstrating how, because of yoga, he could stand on his head, which he proceeded to do right in the middle of the party. I held his glass for him. It was like being in the Father William bit of Alice in Wonderland, even more so when I was greeted by H.B. Bouquet, our editor, swooping towards me in her big hat and cape. "Have you seen the paper?" she was shouting at me over the noisy crowd. "What paper?" I said, amazed to have this famous face shouting at me before she'd even said hello. "Today's Guardian. The chief critic reviews our book and is very fulsome in his praise for you." "Oh," I said, even though I already knew. I was modestly playing dumb. I'd woken up beside my new skinny Cockney boyfriend Phil in his tiny flat in New Cross, and he'd had The Guardian delivered. There was a 2-page review. There was the chief critic slagging off almost every story and essay and poem in the whole 500-page volume, apart from mine. He said all sorts of nice things about mine, and that I was someone we would hear much more from in the future. I had leapt out of bed and jumped up and down for joy. Phil didn't know what was going on, bless him. He really wasn't a bookish person, but he was glad that I seemed to have had some luck. This was a fairly new relationship, a first proper-seeming one for both of us, a long-distance relationship with me up in Lancaster and him in the depths of New Cross. His flat was above a dingy snooker hall on the high street where strange, menacing noises could be heard late at night. But if this career of mine, being a writer, really did take off, I was sure I'd be in London regularly from now on. Jumping up and down on Phil's bed, clutching The Guardian with my very first glowing review. It was one of those moments when you find your whole life changing tracks slightly. When we feel ourselves becoming propelled into the future and a new upcoming life forming mistily on the horizon. I was horribly nervous going to that launch party. My agent joined me, puffing her way on a cigarello and floating down to the venue from her office in an attic in the shadow of the telecom tower. In those days, I would throw up before anything scary such as this party, or most seminar groups I taught or lectures I gave. My stomach would be clenching up and growling. I foolishly tried to settle it with wine, which never really worked out, but succeeded in making me feel a tiny bit more confident for an hour or two. Some of the people at the party were welcoming, such as Harriet, swooping across to me and telling everyone who would listen how my story had been reviewed so fulsomely. But then there were people such as Frankie Dubois, who was a snarling Australian woman in a brightly patterned dress. She was responsible for setting up a famous feminist press in the 1970s, and I knew about her from researching the area for my PhD. She had cultivated and published the work of some of my most treasured authors. When she met me, however, clearly both the wrong gender and the wrong class to gain her support or regard, she looked me up and down. Then she said, to the amusement of those gathered around her, "Your clothes look like something one would give to the poor." I gawped at her. I couldn't believe anyone would set out to be so deliberately rude, trying to shame a stranger in front of her friends. At a fancy do like this, all I'd done was come over to say how much I admired the books she had published over the years, and, introducing myself, saying I had a story in the book we were celebrating this evening, but she looked at me like she just wanted me to die. I was wearing faded and ripped jeans. It was 1995. Of course they were faded and ripped at the knees, but they weren't 501s. They were from Marks and Spencer's. I'd just worn them a lot. I was also in a bomber jacket that I'd recently bought from the market, which I was very proud of. It felt very urban and queer to me, and it also reminded me of Ace from TV's Doctor Who in the late 1980s. But still, Frankie Dubois glared at me up and down and told me I looked like I was dressed like the poor. "But Frankie," I told her, I am the poor." She sneered, and a very tall, posh, fey novelist whose complexion was just like corned beef let out a rattling ha 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 ha. But I couldn't work out whether he was laughing with me or about me. It hardly mattered, and emboldened by the white wine, I moved through the crowd towards the back of the shop where speeches and readings from the book were taking place. And that was when I was taken aside by a smart young woman with dark blonde hair, about my age, who said her name was Carol and that she came from the publicity department of Chatto and Windus. "I was sent here," she said confidingly, over the Frascati in a quiet corner of the shop. "My boss Julian is the publisher and the chief editor at Chatto. We saw the review of your story this morning. I've been sent here to nobble you." "Nobble me?" I asked, alarmed. What was coming next? Already this party was fraught enough. I'd lost track of my agent, who didn't seem to know anyone at all in the room, which was dismaying, since I wanted her to introduce me to people. And I was expecting my boyfriend, Phil, to turn up any minute after work. I was worried he was going to be put off by the poshery and the wah-wah-wah of it all. "We know you sent us your novel last year," Carol whispered to me. Suddenly, we were both in a John le Carré novel. "Before you even had an agent? It's still in my pile, waiting to be looked at." I snatched it up today, remembering the name, when we all read the review, and then we all looked up your story in the book. It's brilliant, by the way, the story. I haven't read the novel yet, but I've started it. Julian is reading it too. We think you're something rather special." "You do?" They did. I beamed at her because she had come dashing all the way from Random House, the Random House building, in the early evening to be at this Charing Cross party, just to nobble me. "Oh, I'd be at this anyway, since it's our paperback imprint doing the anthology, of course. But I've got this special task this evening, and that's making contact with you." She gave me her card. "You must phone us tomorrow, straight away, make contact, come and see us, meet Julian, meet the whole team. Everyone is very keen." She was making the whole thing worthwhile, all the nerves and worry, even the sneeriness of some people I'd met. This was a proper invitation. This was how I dreamed of things happening. It was some weeks before I could get in contact with Carol and Chatto and Windus, however. There was a lot going on up in Lancaster. For some reason, even as a lowly part-time tutor, I was putting the worries of that English department above everything else. I think I was keen to keep myself in good favour, so that I'd carry on getting teaching hours in order to support myself through the rest of the PhD I was doing. I made a mental note for myself for the future. PhDs do not make you happy. They make nobody happy. They are horrible intellectual assault courses that last for years on end, designed by people who endured their own in order to take it all out on future people who might fancy themselves going into academia. They are, for some reason, designed to make people suffer. And that's just what I was doing. Especially in this third year, when my supervisor was off, teaching abroad for a year, and her replacement had never seen me one single time, let alone read any of my chapters. "Oh, you'll be fine," he said, clapping me matily on the back at a drink stew. "You can look after yourself, can't you?" Even then, between finishing my PhD and selling my first book, I had learned that this life in academia and writing mostly involved just getting on with everything by yourself. You could never rely on anyone or depend on anyone or ever really trust anyone. Just get on with your own stuff quietly, almost secretly, doing a fair chunk every day. Don't even tell anyone how much you do or what you're up to. Make it look easy. Pretend to be breezing through and on to the next thing. It's a bit like doing drugs or being a horrible drunk. Hide all the messy stuff and try to look normal. In the dregs of that wintry spring, I was schlepping to the campus to take part in their teaching evaluation exercise, making sure that the department moved up from the previous designation of not bad to super, or whatever their spurious categorizations were. I remember trekking from the 1950s estate where we lived across a park in a horizontal blizzard at 7 a.m, crossing the river to the bus station, taking a bus for miles to campus, and then working all day in seminar rooms and offices just to make that department look good. And then, at the end of it all, we had to clap and whoop when the head of department told us we'd all gained the status of being super. It was the same head of department who told me I'd not be getting any teaching hours next year after all. The very next day that the fax arrived from Chatto and Windus finally offering to buy my novel, the head of department was very piqued by it all. The departmental fax machine had been busy taking faxes for me from agents and editors, all asking me to work with them. I had a lot of offers after that Guardian review, but I ignored most of them. I stayed loyal to the promise of Chatto and Windus and loyal to my slightly dazed-looking agent, Muriel, who smoked black cigarellos. God knows why. I think it was because she had encouraged me for 2 years as I sent new novels every 9 months or so. Not this one, but maybe the next, she kept saying vaguely, puffing on her cigar at the other end of the phone. She was in Fitzrovia, and I'd be in a phone box at the end of my street in Lancaster. Now at last that moment was here, and I was being offered publication by Chatto and Windus, and the English department in Lancaster didn't want me anymore as a part-time tutor as a result. Never mind them, Muriel, my agent, told me. You're heading for bigger and brighter things. I've managed to squeeze an advance of £5,000 out of Chatto for you. I couldn't believe it. £5,000, the very week that I was down to the last £20 of my £1,000 overdraft. Success had come at just the right moment. I'll stop there, and I'll see you again quite soon. Goodbye.